Hello friends, and welcome to tonight's edition of Bedtime Stories for Grown-Ups. It is time to unwind. Find a place where you can safely relax. Settle into that place and take a deep breath. Your day has come to an end. There is nothing left for you to do today but listen to these stories and fall asleep. And so, we begin. The Garden of Memories by C. A. Mercer. The garden looked dreary and desolate in spite of the afternoon sunshine. The lilac and lavender bushes were past their prime. Their wealth of sweetness had been squandered by riotous offshoots. The wind played among the branches and cast changing sun-flecked shadows on the grass-grown paths, narrowed by the encroachment of the box borders that had once lined the way with the stiff precision of troops before a royal progress. The flowers had the air of being overburdened with the monotony of their existence. They could never have had that aspect if they had been only wildflowers and had never experienced human care and companionship. That made the difference. The gate hung on rusty hinges. It answered with a long-drawn-out creaking, as it was pushed open by a man who had been a stranger to the place for nearly 20 years. Yes, the garden was certainly smaller than it had been pictured in his memory. There had been a time when it had appeared as a domain of extensive proportions, and the wood beyond of marvelous depth and intensity. He was conscious of a sense of disappointment. The property would scarcely realize as high a price in the market as he had hoped, and it was incumbent upon him to part with it if he would be released from the narrow circumstances that hemmed him in. He had arranged to meet the lawyer there that afternoon. One of the latter's clients had already made a bid for the estate. The timber, at all events, would add to the value. The house faced southward upon the garden. It was here the man had been brought up by an old great-aunt. He guessed later that she had grudged him any of the endearments that death had denied her, bestowing upon her own children. Her affections had all been buried before he was born. Besides, he took after the wrong branch of the family. She must have possessed a strong personality. It was difficult to bring to mind that it was no longer an existent force. Everyone, from the parson to the servants, had stood a little in awe of her. He remembered the unmovable manner in which she had received the news of the death of a near relative. It had overwhelmed him with a sudden chill, that so she would have received tidings of his own. It had taken all the sunshine in the garden to make him warm again. In the mood that was growing upon him, it would not have much surprised him to find her sitting bolt upright in her carved high-backed chair, as she had sat in the time of his earliest recollections. The thin, yellow hands, on which the rings stood out, folded in her lap. On one occasion she had washed his small hands between hers. The hard luster of the stones acquired a painful association with the ordeal. The blinds would be partially drawn in the musk-scented parlor to save the carpet from further fading, for there had been a tradition of thrift in the family from the time of its settlement, a tradition that had not been maintained by its latest representative. Like the atmosphere of a dream, the years grew dim and misty between now and the time when summer days were longer and sunnier. and it had been counted to him for righteousness if he had amused himself quietly and not given trouble. A stream that he had once dignified with the name of river formed the boundary between the garden and the wood, although it had shrunk into shadow insignificance, with much beside, a faint halo of the romance with which he had endued this early scene of his adventures still clung to the spot. As he came to the stream, he saw the reflection of a face in the water, not his own, but that of one much younger. It was so he met the boy. The child had been placing stepping stones to bridge the stream, and now came across, balancing himself on the slippery surface to test his work. It was odd that he had remained unobserved until this moment, but that was due to the fact of the water rushes on the brink being as tall as he. The boy's eyes met those of the man with a frank, unclouded gaze. He did not appear astonished. That is the way when one is young enough to be continually viewing fresh wonders. One takes everything for granted. He saw at a glance that this other was not alien to him. His instinct remained almost as true as those of the wild nature around. For his own part, he had an unmistakable air of possession about him. He appeared to belong to the place as much as the hollyhocks and the honeysuckle. And yet, how could that be? Probably a child of the caretaker, the man told himself. He had authorized the agent to do what was best about keeping the house in order. He had not noticed what signs it had to show of habitation. Now he saw from the distance that it had not the unoccupied appearance he had expected of it, nor the windows, the dark vacant stare of those that no life behind illumines. "Do you live here?" he asked of the boy. "Yes." The boy turned proudly toward the modest grey pile in the manner of introducing it, forgetting himself in his subject. "It's a very old house. There's a picture over the bureau in the parlor of the man who built it. And planted the trees in the wood, Hannah says." Hannah! It was a foolish repetition of the name. Of course, there were other Hannahs in the world. The old servant of that name, who had told the man stories in his boyhood, had been dead more years than the child could number. "Yes, don't you know Hannah? She'll come and call me in presently, and then you'll see her. Hannah says the trees, have grown up with the family." He assumed a queer importance, evidently in unconscious mimicry of the one who had repeated the tradition to him. "And that with them the house will stand or fall. Do you think the roots really reach so far?" There was an underlying uneasiness in the tone, which it was impossible altogether to disguise. As the other expressed his inability to volunteer an opinion on this point, the boy went on, seeing that his confidences were treated with due respect. "I dug up one myself once. I wished I hadn't afterwards, to make myself a Christmas tree like I'd read about. I just had to hang some old things I had on it. It was only a tiny fir, small enough to go in a flower pot. But that night the house shook, and the windows rattled as if the trees in the forest were trying to get in. I heard them tapping their boughs ever so angrily against the pane. As soon as it was light, I went out and planted the Christmas tree again. I hadn't meant to keep it out of the ground long. They might have known that." "Have you no playfellows here?" The boy gave a comprehensive glance around. "There are the trees. They are good fellows. I wouldn't part with one of them. It's fine to hear them all clap their hands when we are all jolly together. There are nests in them, too, and squirrels. We see a lot of one another." This statement was not difficult to believe. The Holland overalls bore evident traces of fellowship with mossy trunks. The boy did most of the talking. He had more to tell of the founder of the family, whose portrait hung in the parlor, and of how, when he, the child, grew up, he rather thought of writing books, as that same ancestor had done, and making the name great and famous again. He had not decided what kind of books he should write yet. Was it very hard to find words to rhyme if one tried poetry? He was at no pains to hide such fancies and ambitions, of which his kind are generally too sensitive, or too ashamed to speak to their elders, and which are, as a rule, forgotten as soon as outgrown. "Shall we go in the wood now?" said the boy. "It's easy enough to cross over the stepping stones." "Yes, let us go." The man was beginning to see everything through the boy's eyes. The garden was again much as he had remembered it, enclosed in a world of beautiful mystery. Nothing was really altered. What alteration he had imagined had been merely a transitory one in himself. The child had put a warm, eager hand into his. Together they went into the wood, as happy as a pair of truant schoolboys. They might have been friends of long standing. "So, this is your enchanted forest?" said the man. "Not really enchanted," replied the boy seriously. "I once read of one, but of course it was only in a fairy tale. That one vanished as soon as one spoke the right word. It would be a very wrong word that could make this vanish." He had a way of speaking of the wood as if it were some sacred grove. The companion suddenly felt guilty, not quite knowing why. Of course, someone might cut them down. The boy lowered his voice. It seemed shameful to mention the perpetration of such a deed aloud. It would be terrible to hear them groan when the axe struck them. The young ones mightn't mind so much, but it would be bad for the grandfather trees, who've been here from the beginning. Hannah says one would still hear them wailing on stormy nights, even if they had been felled and carted away. Yes, even then, though, to be sure, there would be no one to hear the wailing if it's true that the house must fall too, at the same time. But we needn't trouble about that. None of it is likely to happen. You see, if it did, where should I be?" He laughed merrily. This last argument appeared to him to be quite conclusive. Such an important consideration placed the awful contingency quite out of the question, and transformed it into nothing more than a joke. Child's laughter died away as they both stood still to listen. Each thought he heard his own name called. "It's Hannah," said the boy, and off he raced toward the house, barely saving himself from running into the arms of another person who had turned in at the gate. "Who was the boy who ran around by the espaliers a minute ago? One would scarcely have judged him to be a child of the caretaker." The man's heart sank with a dull thud. Something had told him the answer before it came. "Child?" The lawyer looked puzzled. "I did not see one. No children have any business in this garden. Neither is there any caretaker here. The house has been shut up altogether since the old servant you called Hannah died 11 years ago." They had reached the veranda. The westering sun had faded off the windows. It was easy to see that the house was empty. The shutters were up within, and the panes dark and weather-stained. Birds had built their nests undisturbed about the chimney stacks. Their hearthstones had long been cold. My client is willing to purchase the property on the terms originally proposed, the lawyer was saying. He contemplates investing in it as a building site. Of course, the timber would have to be felled. A breeze passed through the treetops like a shudder. The younger man interposed. "I am sorry you should have had the trouble of coming here, but I have decided to keep the old place after all. Stick and stone. It is not right it should go out of the family. I must pull my affairs together as well as I can without that." The little phantom of his dead boyhood was to suffer no eviction. The Clearest Voice by Margaret Sherwood. The little business frown which John Wareham usually wore only at his office, and put off as he put on his hat in starting for home, lingered that evening, persisting through the long streetcar ride, the walk past rows of suburban houses, and even to the brook at the foot of the hill below his home. Here it vanished, for the brook marked the spot where the world stopped, and Alice began. He watched with a meditative, happy smile the rough stone fence, which bordered this bit of meadow land, with a trailing woodbine and clematis that made it a thing of beauty. And as he climbed the hill, the deepening color of the sunset clouds, and the notes of a wood thrush from the forest edge not far away, became part of a deep sense of harmony, breaking a mood of anxiety and fear. Then came the comforting glimpse of the red brick house, through the encompassing green, with its wide daintiness of porch, fan window, and window facings. It all looked like her. In its serene and simple distinction, it seemed to embody her. Her creative touch was everywhere. The bay window, about which they had disagreed when the house was planned, had, surprisingly, turned out to the liking of both. As he fumbled at the latch of the gate, and pinched his fingers as he always did, a vexed sense of triumph came to him, for it surely would have worked better if he had insisted on having his own way. Everywhere were traces of little worries and little triumphs, the latter predominating. It was the very soul of home, from the threshold to the branches of the tall elm, which touched the roof protectingly. It was wholly desirable, and it might have to go. As he followed the brick wall in bitterness, he closed his eyes that he might not see, and so ran into a porch pillar, the one on which Alice's red roses were blossoming. The queer little groan that he gave in some strange way took on the sound of railroads, and again railroads, as he beat his head against the pillar once or twice purposely, and his voice had a note of contempt. He had not felt that way about railroads when he had invested his savings, partly in the stock of a new railroad in the west, partly in the stock of an old railroad in the east, that was doing wild things in the way of improvements. Then there had been nothing too good for him to say about the earning power of railroads, the wise management of railroads, the net profits of railroads. Now both railroads were in trouble. Dividends were cut, and the stock which he had hoped to sell at a profit had dropped almost to zero. The mortgage loan on his house was due in a month, and he, a man earning only a moderate salary in a real estate office, had nothing in the world wherewith to meet the emergency. Even the savings bank deposit had gone into railroad stock, in order that the mortgage might be paid off more quickly. But his face lighted up with a smile, both sad and bright, which made quite a different face of it as he crossed the threshold. that threshold on which Alice had stopped to kiss him the day he had married her and brought her home. There was something here that shut out all the trouble in the universe. About the doorway his wife's laughter seemed to be always floating. That laughter, merry, touched with tenderness, made up of mirth and sorrow, as all wise laughter is. Just then came little Jack to meet him, speeding madly down the baluster, and John, as he picked up his boy, kissed him and reproved him of coming downstairs that way, had nothing to answer, when his son averred that it was lots better than a railroad, save that might well be. "There's ice cream for dinner," the boy exploded, and the father, roughly smoothing Jack's tousled hair, started as he caught a sound of chatter from the living room, and stood still in dismay. That today, of all days, should be the time of the family gathering which brought 2 uncles, 2 aunts, and 3 cousins to the house. How completely he had forgotten. He hung up his hat and grasped little Jack's hand. He would tell them nothing about his troubles, nothing. He would be the ideal host, concealing his personal vexations under a cordial smile. But hardly had he opened the door, with his office bag still held absent-mindedly in his hand, when they were upon him. The cordial smile did not deceive them for a minute. Aunt Janet, who was sitting by the fireplace, looked the most troubled of all, though she said nothing. It was, "Why, John, what's the matter?" from Aunt Mary, and, "Well, John, how goes it?" from Uncle Philip, who looked as if he knew that it went very badly indeed. "And what makes you look so worried? With a home like this, no man ought to look worried," from his cousin Austin, who had recently become engaged and was thinking about homes. He nodded approvingly at the room, which was simply furnished, soft in coloring, with English ginsems, a few pictures of trees and of water, all out-of-door things, and a fireplace that showed signs of constant use. John's face brightened as he caught this look of admiration. Not all the confusion of greeting and inquiries in regard to health, not all the business worries in the world could check the sense of peace that always came to him in entering this room, which, more perfectly than any other spot, expressed the personality of Alice. He managed to make his way through the little crowd of sympathetic wrinkled faces, and wandering smooth faces. There were, it was discovered, comfortable chairs enough for all, and John found himself, as host, the center of a little group bent on probing his affairs, in friendly fashion, to the bottom. It was his sister Emily who finally started the flood of questioning that led to the betrayal of the secret he had meant to keep for the present. She came bustling in through the door, leading to the dining room, looking anxious as soon as she glanced at her brother, and from the brass bowl of yellow roses held unsteadily in her hand, and a few drops spattered to the floor. "Are you ill, John?" she asked, "or have you lost?" Among all the many voices of inquiry, comment, question whereby she was interrupted, the voice of Alice was the clearest, making the others, no matter how near the speaker stood, seem to come from far away. Little Jack came and climbed upon his father's knee, a curious reproduction of the family look of worry appearing on his chubby face. John the elder leaned his head back in the chintz-covered chair, shutting his eyes for a minute with a sense of warmth and satisfaction and the nearness of the cuddling body of his son. "Everything's the matter," he said wearily. "Everything." And he had a momentary twinge of conscience, realizing that he was not being the ideal host. They all watched him anxiously, sympathetically, in silence, and Aunt Mary, near the window, went on drawing her needle in and out. With exquisite precision, her grey head bent over a centerpiece which she intended to present to the house. "Oh no, I'm not ill," said John Wareham, suddenly sitting upright. "But the Long Gorge Railroad has gone into a receiver's hands, and 3 days ago the New York and Nineveh cut its dividend. I'm done for." Emily gave a little gasp, and said nothing. "You will pull through all right," asserted Uncle Philip, stirring up the fire in order to hide his face. And Cousin Austen slapped John's shoulder, saying facetiously, "Take courage, Jeremiah, the worst is yet to come." John laughed in spite of himself, and struck his fist upon the knee not occupied by Jack. "Every dollar I had in the world I had drawn out and put into those 2 cursed things. Now I've nothing. No capital, no credit. The place has got to go." "No, no," cried the womenfolk. "The place has got to go," repeated John Wareham, his face in little Jack's hair. "And I feel as if I could rob a bank or a jewelry store to prevent that." Jack burst into a delighted giggle, through which John heard, "You wouldn't do any such thing, and you mustn't talk that way before Jack." It was Alice who spoke, with a little catch in her voice that sometimes came, halfway between a laugh and a sob, and it was echoed by the 2 aunts. "Railroads," growled John with supreme contempt. "It would have been a great deal better if railroads had never been invented. Jack, we shall have to get a prairie schooner and track to the west." Jack's eyes shone like stars, but he got no chance to say anything, for, with that outburst, the springs of speech were loosened. There was the clamor, the chorus clamor, of relatives indignant, inquisitive, sympathetic relatives, all eager to help, and all uneasily conscious that their own small measure of prosperity would hardly stand the strain. He shook his head sadly in answer to the inquiry as to whether he could not borrow. He had no security. Aunt Mary did not fail to remind him that she had warned him at the time. Aunt Janet, in a thin but affectionate voice, admitted that she had suffered in the same way heavily. And then the clock ticked through a brief silence. "Why don't you read your letters?" asked Emily suddenly. She stood absent-mindedly arranging the flowers with one finger, busy already with plans for the future. There was a small pile of letters on the center table, quite within John's reach. He began tearing open the envelopes in mechanical fashion, throwing them untidily upon the floor. As each one fell, Jack slid down and picked it up, climbing back to his father's knee. One was a wedding announcement. One was a plumber's bill. And the third. John paused, read, looked up bewildered, and read again. "Why, Emily!" he exploded boyishly. "This can't be. Read that, will you, and tell me if I've lost my mind." Emily put down the roses and read the letter slowly, wonderingly, smiling even as her brother had smiled. "Not Uncle John. And we were always so afraid of him." $20,000, murmured John. Open-mouthed silence waiting upon them until Cousin Austen broke the spell with, "I say, would you mind if I looked over your shoulder?" And John flung him the letter with a little whoop of joy. "Is this plain living, or is this a fairy story?" he demanded quizzically. "I never thought of myself as a dark-eyed hero with a fortune dropping into my hands just in the nick of time. A title ought to go with it." The vibrant energy of the man was back again. The dry humor which, in sunny seasons, quivered about his mouth, was once more there. the mocking incredulity of his words, belied the growing look of peace and service in his face. The years seemed slipping from him, bringing him a mellow boyhood. $20,000 isn't exactly a fortune, John. It will buy the place twice over, exulted the man. And we shan't have to start for the West in a prairie schooner right away. Shan't we, Papa? Asked little Jack in hungry disappointment. But the child's shrill voice had little chance where everybody was speaking at once. Aunt Mary's, well, I hope you hang on to this and not be foolish again. And Cousin Austin's, you deserve it, John. And Uncle Howard's, well, I am glad. Shake. And several other congratulatory remarks all came at once. The poor old fellow, the poor old fellow, said John to himself softly, rubbing his hands. I suppose he died out in Oklahoma, all alone. How he happened to will this to me, I give up. He didn't like me very well. The very atmosphere of the room had changed. Once more, a feeling of quiet pleasure pervaded it. The full sense of home, peace, security came back, with a suggestion of a kettle singing on the hearth, though there was no kettle nearer than the kitchen. But there's Frank. It must have been Alice who suggested this. And as something disturbing, questioning, crept into the air. Frank, said John Barron suddenly. Why, I'd forgotten all about Frank. We haven't heard of him for more than 15 years or so, have we? More than that, answered Emily. He was in Mexico, the last we knew. He may be living, suggested John. Mexico is always such a state. I suppose the mails can't be trusted. We ought to find out, said Alice. Uncle John had cast him off, suggested Emily tentatively, anxiously. But he was Uncle John's own son, said Alice earnestly, compellingly. And wasn't Uncle John in the wrong? Uncle John was a queer customer, said John hastily. He was cranky, and no doubt about it, he wasn't crazy. And if this lawyer's statement is correct, I've got a good legal right to the 20,000, haven't I? Of course you have, said Aunt Mary. But the moral right, whispered Alice. What was the quarrel about anyway? Asked Austin. Frank's marriage, wasn't it? I never heard much about it. That was part of it, said Aunt Janet. Frank, you know, fell in love with a little country girl whom his father did not want him to marry. But he insisted on having his way, and married her. Good for him, nodded Austin approvingly. Little Jack, glancing from one to another with wide blue eyes, was silently weaving his philosophy of life and his interpretation of humanity. Religion was mixed up in it in some way, contributed John. Uncle grew to be something of a fanatic, and he wanted them both to believe what he believed, and they wouldn't, or didn't, or couldn't. It was incompatibility of temper all around, I dare say. Frank was a good son, reminded Alice. He was patient with his father, and he all but gave up his life for Uncle John, nursing him through diphtheria. More and more, the sweet, persistent voice brought trouble and question into the atmosphere from which trouble and question had so suddenly cleared. The new security began to seem unstable. The new-found joy, a stolen thing. Even in the pauses, the personality of the woman spoke from curtain and cushion and fireplace of this room of her devising. She dominated the whole, seeming the only presence there. Brother and sister and guests shrank in the radiance of her. Do you really think I ought to hunt Frank up? Asked the man. Emily shook her head, but doubtfully. You probably couldn't find him after all these years. I could try, admitted John. Nonsense, cried Aunt Mary over her embroidery. You stay right where you are and pay off your mortgage. A man who has worked as hard as you have and has had as much trouble ought to take a bit of good luck when it comes. Think how much good you could do with it, murmured Aunt Janet. As the pickpocket said when he put the stolen dime in the collection plate, said Austen. But fortunately, Aunt Janet did not understand. Uncle had a right to do what he pleased with his own, said John defiantly. If he chose to cast off his son for reasons which he considered sufficient, he had the right. But you cannot cast off your son, persisted Alice. John, we have a boy of our own. You know that the obligation is one of all eternity. You cannot get rid of your fatherhood. Oh, Papa, you hurt me? Squealed little John, suddenly interrupted in his philosophy weaving. Confound it all, cried John, with sudden irritation. Isn't this just like life? To hold out the rope, just to grab it away again with a grin. I won't, I say. What is mine is mine. But it isn't yours. Did Frank have any children? He asked. Several, I believe, admitted Emily reluctantly. And he never got on. He never got on. And the 20,000 might save their pesky little souls. The child's laughter rippled out across the shocked silence of the elders. Maybe Uncle John left him something, suggested Emily. For a man who tried such big things, this doesn't seem much money. Her brother shook his head. The entire sum of which he stands possessed, he read from the lawyer's letter. You might make a few inquiries through the post. I rather imagine the Mexican mail service isn't very trustworthy, suggested Aunt Mary hopefully. He looked at her, but in abstracted fashion, as if it were not to Aunt Mary that he was listening. I'll write to this Oklahoma lawyer, and then I must go to Mexico. Isn't it a little quixotic? It's most likely all kinds of foolishness, like everything else I do, groaned the man. But it's what I'd want for my little chap, if I were dead and he alive, and had quarrelled with him. I suppose I could keep this money and save my skin, but you couldn't keep it without finding out, murmured Alice, because you are you, and the real you is incapable of doing a mean thing. You must do as you think best, said Emily at last. Maybe if you find Frank, he won't want it all, but will divide, knowing that his father willed it to you. That may be as it may be, said the man, leaning back in his chair with the face of one listening. But I go to Mexico. It's a queer game we play here, and I'll be dashed if I can understand it. But I'm going to play it as fair as I know how. So, the voice of Alice won. Of Alice, who had been dead for 5 long years.